So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Will Trevor. I'm Assistant Dean and Director of Online Programs here at Albany Law School. Welcome to you, and thanks for joining us for our webinar, Cannabis Law, the Path to Legalization in New York. We're delighted to have you here, and if we could go to the next slide. There's just a few issues of housekeeping to remember. We do have closed captioning turned on, which you'll see down there. If you want to change the size of the closed captioning, you can. You'll see a subtitles settings menu, which you can make changes. This is being recorded, and so a copy of this recording will be made available to you afterwards. Also, there is the ability to post questions. You'll see in the toolbar along the bottom, there's a Q&A tab. If you click on that, you can add some questions in there. We will try and come to them during the course of the program. Often there's far more than we can handle in the time available. So please don't be offended if we miss you out, but we will try and handle most of the questions. There will also be, at the end of this event, a survey, which would be grateful if you could respond to. My colleague Nicole will also be posting a link during the program as well. So it will give you an added opportunity to give us your feedback. Just a reminder that this event, it will go through until 2 o'clock, but we are offering an extra half an hour for questions, simply because of the interest that has been shown in this event. Next slide, please. Now, CLE credit, continuing legal education credit, is available for this program. Now, we have been certified by New York State Continuing Legal Education Board as an accredited provider of CLE. This webinar has been accredited as a source of 1 CLE credit for both transitional and non-transitional attorneys in New York State. New York State Continuing Legal Education Board regulations state that credit shall be awarded only for an attendance at an entire course or program, or for attendance in an entire session of a course or program. No credit shall be awarded for attending a portion of a course or a portion of a session, and a password will actually be mentioned partway through the program, so please look out for that. Next slide, please. Now, we offer a number of programs at Albany Law School as part of our online graduate programs. They are 100% online. They are asynchronous as well, which means that they're flexible to fit in with your schedule. The Human Resources Law, Leadership and Policy graduate program, well, that launched in spring of 2021. It is available as a certificate, a master's and an LLM. The latter can be completed in as little as 12 months. And it is industry focused and SHRM aligned, which means it's aligned with the principles of SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Management. I mentioned it's flexible to meet your career needs, and the whole program has been designed, and it is indeed taught by leading HR industry professionals. So give us a call either on 518-443-5260, or my colleague Nicole will be posting a link for you to make an appointment to talk to us, or send us an email to graduateadmissions@albanylaw.edu. Next slide, please. And also, of direct relevance to the webinar that you're watching today, we have health law and compliance. Again, certificate, master's, LLM. It's designed to equip those employed or seeking employment in the healthcare industry with the knowledge and skills needed to succeed in this dynamic field. Now, dual degree options are available, and the certificates, as with the HR program, can be completed in as little as 3 months. Again, give us a call, 518-443-5260, or email us, graduateadmissions@albanylaw.edu. Next slide, please. Now, if you're wanting to apply for our programs, the deadline that's coming up is Monday, May the 17th, and that will be for the summer 1 term, which starts on Monday, May the 24th. Again, if you want to contact us, the email's there, the phone number is there, or there's a link for you to book an appointment. We'll be happy to speak with you. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the moderator of the panel for today. Her name is Ty Harasme. Now, Ty is a third-year law student at Albany Law School. She's pursuing a Master of Science in Bioethics at the Alden March Bioethics Institute at Albany Medical College. She's a native of Sunset Park, Brooklyn. She graduated cum laude from Binghamton University, obtaining her BA in political science in Latin American and Caribbean studies. And she's held internships at the New York State Assembly, the New York State Office of the Attorney General, Claims Bureau, and the New York State Department of Health, Division of Legal Affairs. And she has a general interest in health law and insurance. Ty, welcome to you.
Thank you, Will, for introducing me. Hi, all, and welcome to today's webinar titled Cannabis Law, the Path to Legalization in New York. My name is Taire Erasme, and I'm a graduating 3L at Albany Law School and a master's candidate at the Alden March Bioethics Institute at Albany Medical College. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we officially begin with our speakers, I just want to draw attention to the uniqueness of today's panel. As you're already aware, this webinar is titled The Path to Legalization in New York. The individuals that compose this panel have very much been involved in various aspects of cannabis legalization efforts and have worked together on these matters for the past 5 years. What we have here are 4 of the biggest movers and shakers with respect to cannabis law in New York State. We have Rick, who provided legal stewardship to all the programs as General Counsel of the New York State Department of Health. Nicole, who built the medical marijuana program from its beginning. Chris, who's responsible for birthing the MRTA and putting it on the political radar. And finally, Axel, who has been the lead negotiator in all of these bills. With that said, I think that today we're in for much more than just a recitation of the MRTA. As a reminder, each panelist is expressing their opinions as individuals and not on behalf of the law school or any employer or any organization. Before I pass it on to our first speaker, I will introduce Rick a little more in depth. Rick Zumbauder, former General Counsel to the New York State Department of Health. Rick has extensive experience as an attorney in the field of healthcare operations, regulatory frameworks, and litigation. In his capacity as General Counsel, Rick led the 180-member Division of Legal Affairs and represented the 6,000-member staff of the entire department. The department has regulatory jurisdiction over matters including controlled substances, medical marijuana, cannabinoid hemp, hospitals, laboratories, infectious diseases, and certain licensed healthcare professionals, including physicians. So with that, I will share my screen to show you the slides, and I will pass it on to Rick.
Thank you, Ty. It was a pleasure having you as my intern at the Division of Legal Affairs, and it's been a pleasure working with you on this project too right now. As some of you may be aware, at the end of March 30th, the legislature passed the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and on March 31, the governor signed that bill into law. Effectively, that ended the war on drugs, at least with respect to cannabis. And the people who were responsible for that, in large part, were Axel and Chris, who will be speaking to us a little later on in this program. There always wasn't a war on drugs. Ty, if you could go to the next slide. There was a time, and it was in the 1800s, when the country embraced drugs. Morphine, cocaine, and heroin were used as psychoactive medicines. Next slide, Ty. For example, here's an advertisement for cocaine. This was dated 1884, advertised for children. And next slide. This advertisement involves soothing syrup for children who are teething, and the operative drug there is morphine. 1887 was the date for that. The next slide is a combination of cocaine and wine, so it's alcohol and cocaine in this product that existed. Next slide. Pope Leo XIII got into the action as well, advocating for a cocaine wine tonic. And next slide, Ty. These pictures show how heroin and opium were combined and vaporized for the benefit of people with asthmatic conditions. various different oils were placed in that burner in the middle and then dispersed into the air for almost everyone in the room, I guess, to be affected by. This is an advertisement for Bayer, and notice that the aspirin content also includes heroin. And next slide. Paregoric was another product. It's a combination of alcohol and opium, but look at the age for the recommended usage: 5 days old, 5 drops, etc. This was definitely marketed for children and adults. Next slide. It is true that Coca-Cola started off as a product that contained cocaine from 1886 until 1906. Cocaine was in the product. This label happens to actually say cocaine removed because it was a label from the 1906 timeframe. Okay, next slide. The war on drugs has basically 3 federal statutes that are key ingredients, key weapons, if you will. And the first one that came into being, the first federal statute, was in 1914, called the Federal Harrison Narcotics Act. It taxed opium or coca leaves. Didn't outright ban the use of these products, to simply impose the tax. Next slide, Ty. The purpose for the Harrison Narcotics Act could be said to be to target minority communities. And I raise that in the sense of a social equity question. And Chris and Axel will deal with this a little later too, but as a way of a preface, an introductory session, I learned that there was an effort to attribute opium addiction caused by the Chinese immigrant community to the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act. There was a newspaper that printed an article about a pastor of a Catholic church called Catholic Church of the Transfiguration in New York City. And it was located in a neighborhood adjacent to a community of Chinese people. And the newspaper printed a statement from the Catholic priest and also tried to explain that the statement was preposterous, but nevertheless, the statement was made in the press. Next slide, Ty. And the statement was, quote unquote, "Many girls who live in this neighborhood have been ruined by these Chinese people. Children as young as 11 and 12 have been led into the opium dens where they are induced to stupefy themselves with opium." Next slide, please, Ty. 1914 also followed the 1898 Spanish-American War. And of course, we prevailed in that war. But what happened also was the Philippine Islands and the Spanish system that existed there of providing opium to recovering addicts became part of our inheritance, if you will, from the acquisition of the lands. And also there was a lot of resentment against Mexican immigrants who fought with the Spanish against the United States. Next slide. At that time, in the 1914 era, the Episcopalian missionaries that were in the country opposed any opium use, and they were able to explain to the legislatures and to the Congress that Chinese opium businesses and physicians should be constrained in their effort to prescribe opium. As an example, physicians were only allowed to prescribe opium in the course of their professional practice, but that was interpreted by law enforcement as never. All right, next slide, please, Ty. There also was another targeted minority community. It was the African American community, and prejudice, if you will, it was a part of the reason why that the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 was enacted too. And a newspaper in New York City published an account of cocaine-crazed killers, quote unquote, insensible to lawmen's bullets. And the headline at that time read, next one slide. Okay, thanks, Ty. "African-American cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace." Next slide. Now this is a slide that shows 3 stamps which are part of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. It would be the second federal statute in the war on drugs. Next slide, please. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, a federal act, taxed the entire plant except mature stalks. And you can see there were the various rates. So this too was a tax. It was not an outright ban, but still it led to various interpretations and enforcements for people who weren't paying the taxes. And the question that has to be asked again in a social equity manner could be, was this passed in an effort to target minority communities? Next slide, Ty. It has been attributed in part to resentment of that same Mexican community that fought on behalf of the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, and also cannabis violence allegedly by the Mexican immigrant community. Next slide, Ty. There was an effort in the early 20th century to use the terms marijuana with a J or an H to imply Mexican Spanish roots with the plant and with the drug. And especially after the war, there was a lot of resentment against the Mexicans. And they decided as proponents of the 1937 Marijuana Act that it was an effective propaganda tool to use it to associate violence with Mexican minority communities. And this headline was also something that ran in a Los Angeles paper. Crazed Mexican runs amok and creates reign of terror in Plaza District. Next slide, Ty. In 1937, there was a film that also came out at the time. It was called Reefer Madness. And I don't know if you've seen it. I have seen it long ago, but it described the violence associated with marijuana. It had other names: Tell Your Children, Marijuana, or Assassin of Youth. And even though this was 1937, I wanted to just mention, remember March 22, there was a shooting in Boulder, Colorado, and 10 people were killed. I found a letter that a group of physicians, pharmacists, and others wrote to the NRA. This is March 30, 2021. And much in line with the theme of Reefer Madness, their letter states, in part, in places here, quote unquote, the role of marijuana-induced psychosis, which is becoming more common in violence, is also well documented. NRA needs to call attention to marijuana-induced psychosis as a cause of mass shootings. Mass murder is on the rise. We have to ask, what has changed in society to increase the numbers of mass murders? Two of the things that have changed are the increase of marijuana use and its potency. Okay, next slide, Ty. The third act that was enacted as part of the war on drugs was the 1970 Federal Controlled Substances Act. This act criminalized marijuana and defined it in certain ways, as we know now. I wanted to mention right here too, I think this is appropriate time. I found that Legal Aid Society did a study of people of color who were arrested on marijuana charges in the year 2020 in New York City. That's 2020, so that's 50 years after the enactment of this act. And 94% of those arrested for marijuana crimes under this act were people of color. Next slide, please. There's two plants that are growing in the Amazon jungle. One is called Psychotria, another one is called Banisteriopsis, and they contain a compound called dimethyltryptamine. It's a hallucinogenic. The compounds work in synergy with each other. Next slide, please, Ty. And they're combined into a product called ayahuasca, and it's really a sacrament for a religious sect. And there are two major religions that exist in the United States that practice this sacrament. Sometimes it's used to treat PTSD. Next slide, please. So the question we might ask is, isn't that drug DMT a prohibited Schedule I drug under that 1970 Federal Controlled Substances Act? And the answer is yes. Next slide, please. But because of a court case, Supreme Court, US Supreme Court in 2006, called Gonzalez, etc., the Supreme Court upheld the sacramental use of this combination of plants. And I think the significance of this is the first, perhaps, reverse shift in the war on drugs. And let's go to the next slide. In 2014, there was a shift too, which was called the Federal Agricultural Act, also known as the 2014 Farm Bill. It authorized state departments of agriculture to regulate industrial hemp as part of a pilot program. Next slide, please. And industrial hemp is defined as any part of the marijuana plant containing, or the cannabis plant, containing not more than 0.3% of the psychoactive component called THC. I should mention here that Rand Paul, who's a senator from Kentucky, where a lot of hemp is grown, has just introduced a bill where he would try to persuade Congress to increase that 0.3% value to 1.0%, and also have it measured at the point of the processed product, not at the point of the plant material. We'll see how that goes, but it's another interesting shift from Kentucky on opening up hemp. In 2014, there was also a New York State bill that became law, and it was amended in 2020. It gave the Department of Agriculture and Markets the authority to regulate and license the growth, cultivation, and sale of hemp. And hemp can be used in so many products, textiles, bricks, fabric, wood, kind of construction materials, a lot of different things. So the Department of Agriculture and Markets in New York State has jurisdiction over industrial hemp, but not where it is intended for human consumption in the form of cannabinoid content. Next slide, please. The 2018 Farm Bill authorized the production of hemp and authorized states to have their own little pilot programs. But all pilot programs are going to expire at the end of this year, and that will be on 1/1/22. Next slide. And the USDA is authorized as part of this Farm Bill to oversee hemp production, but New York State has not submitted a plan to date to continue its pilot program. So it's not certain what will happen as 2021 unfolds and 2022 arrives. There's also a definition change was made in the 2018 Farm Bill so that the Controlled Substances Act did not include industrial hemp. And next slide. New York State Department of Health has proposed regulations concerning cannabinoid hemp products. Those are products that are intended for human consumption or application. Next slide. And there are 4 different kinds of licenses that the New York State Department of Health is currently taking applications for and administering if anyone wants to get into the cannabinoid hemp business. Next slide, please. Now let's skip that one, Ty, and let's go to the next one. This is a picture of one of those cannabinoid hemp products that's on the New York State market that will be part of the New York State Department of Health jurisdiction. And next slide. I mentioned before the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, MRTA. It does have 2 provisions that relate to industrial hemp. One provision is that it transfers jurisdiction from the Department of Health to another new entity that Axel will talk more about called the Office of Cannabis Management. And it also permits retailer licensees to sell hemp flowers. And if they're sold as raw hemp flowers in a jar, then that can be done as hemp. But if it's a product that's sold as a hemp flower in an edible or a smoked way, then that has to be done through the adult use regulations. Ty, that's all I have. So I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Nicole Quackenbush, and you. Thank you so much for moving the slides along. Appreciate it.
So before I introduce Nicole, I will just like to say for the viewers, the CLE password is hemp, H-E-M-P. So thank you. And Nicole. So Nicole Quackenbush, former medical marijuana program director for the New York State Department of Health. Nicole is currently the Senior Director of Clinical Account Services for Magellan RX Management, providing oversight and promoting clinical best practices for Magellan's ABAP Center of Excellence. Nicole has over 22 years of diverse professional experience, including experience with retail pharmacy, program management, regulatory development, compliance, prescription drug monitoring programs, and implementation of IT solutions in the healthcare setting. Prior to joining Magellan RX management team, Nicole worked for the New York State Department of Health, where she served as director of the New York State Medical Marijuana Program from the inception of the program. So Nicole, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Ty.
As I share the screen again.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Ty mentioned, I have over 22 years of experience as a pharmacist, and never did I imagine that I would be here today talking about medical cannabis. It's very exciting to share information about this program. Next slide, please. So just wanted to talk a little about what cannabis is before we get into the medical program that exists today in New York State. And I do think it's important to share a little bit about where we are today because it helps to understand some of the changes and where we'll be in the future. So cannabis does contain multiple compounds, cannabinoids. There are hundreds, and the main cannabinoids are THC and CBD. Many of you have probably heard of THC as the component responsible for the psychoactive effects that we see. And the CBD is not as responsible for those psychoactive effects and may have a balancing effect when in combination with the THC. In addition to the different cannabinoids, there are terpenes that are a component of cannabis that are responsible for the aroma. And I think Rick might have mentioned this, but the industrial hemp cutoff when it goes from the THC that's regulated in one program versus medical is 0.3%. Next slide, please. So a little more on the pharmacology. We all have an endocannabinoid system. There's been a lot of research in this area. One of the main researchers actually responsible for the discovery of Delta-9 THC is Raphael McCollum, an Israeli researcher who's also done a lot of work on research into discovering the natural endocannabinoids that are produced and work with this endocannabinoid system. So basically, this is just to demonstrate that we have this system in place, and as a result, there could be an imbalance in the endocannabinoid system where cannabis plays a role in helping with different medical conditions. And that's where we're starting to see a lot of the research and also the reason why we have many people today in a medical cannabis program looking for a therapeutic alternative to help with different conditions. Next slide, please. So cannabis comes in many different forms. One of the things many people see on TV and commercials is the jars of plant material, but there are products for vaporization. There are products that can be ingested orally in a capsule format, different lozenges, all different kinds of things that we have seen in the manufacturer. So it's not a one size fits all. And with the different forms that it comes in, the onset of action varies. So with smoking and inhalation, you get your most rapid onset of action. And with some of those other forms, such as an oral capsule, the onset is delayed, but may be more prolonged than smoking. So cannabis does accumulate in the fatty tissues after consumption. So it does reach a peak concentration in 4 to 5 days, but the complete elimination because of that accumulation may take up to 30 days, which is why sometimes it can pose a little bit of a challenge when it comes to testing. Next slide, please. So here we have a map just showing you the landscape of state cannabis programs. And you can see in the very dark green and the very bright green, we have those states who have either a comprehensive medical cannabis program or those states that have both an adult and medical use program. And in 1996, California was the first state to legalize medical cannabis. Next slide, please. So in New York State, we were obviously not the first because our Compassionate Care Act was not signed into law by Governor Cuomo until July of 2014. What was happening around that time period is that there were a lot of patients that were seeking medical cannabis to help in their different conditions, and some patients even moving to other states or crossing state lines, which again presents a challenge given the federal status of cannabis. So this law offered a way for patients who are suffering from different serious conditions to be able to obtain cannabis for those conditions. The law set forth an 18-month implementation timeframe, and that program was implemented within 18 months on time, allowing patients to be able to purchase medical cannabis in New York State beginning on January 7th, 2016. Next slide, please. So how New York's program works according to the current law and regulations in the Compassionate Care Act. Prescribers who complete a New York State Department approved course then register with the New York State Department of Health, which allows them to issue certifications to patients who have one of the serious conditions that are defined in the law or that are added by the commissioner in regulation. So those patients who receive the certifications then must register with the New York State Department of Health in order to obtain a registry ID card, which allows them to purchase medical cannabis from any of the registered organizations located in New York State. And in New York State, we have 10 registered organizations. At the time of implementation back in 2016, we had 5 registered organizations, and each of those registered organizations can have up to 4 dispensing facilities. So there were a total of 20 with the first 5 registered organizations. Next slide, please. So this slide here just shows you the implementation pathway from the signing of the law to the initial dispensing. There were a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that had to be put together in a pretty quick time frame to be able to get cannabis into the hands of patients who are suffering from these serious conditions while trying to balance protecting public health and safety. So there was a regulatory development process, the registered organization request for applications and registering of those organizations. Those organizations also needed time to get their buildings up and running and product growing and products manufactured and ready for dispensing. So it was a tremendous effort, but it again was done on time by January 7th, 2016. Next slide, please. So I talked about serious conditions. The slide here lists the different serious conditions that a patient must have in order to qualify. Not going to read them to you, but there are a couple of notes in red. Chronic pain was not in the original legislation that was added in regulation in March of 2017, as PTSD was added into law on November 11th, 2017. And then additional regulations around any conditions where an opioid may be prescribed to allow this as another alternative, as well as for substance use disorder. Next slide, please. So in addition to having a serious condition, the law requires that the patient have a clinically associated condition. So for example, cancer is a serious condition. One of these other conditions would need to be associated with that cancer diagnosis. Next slide, please. This slide comes from the Department of Health's 2-year report on the medical use of marijuana. It's available on the website. I like to show this slide because while the data is a little bit dated as it's through June of 2018, it does show a spread in utilization. You can see that the majority of the utilizers are in the 41 to 50 age bracket and the 51 to 60 age bracket. But of note, there are several pediatric patients that were also patients in this program, as well as elderly patients. So we served a diverse population. And again, this also demonstrates that with adult use cannabis and the new law, that there's still a need for a medical cannabis program because you have these patients who have these conditions. They may be on a whole host of other medications and have other complications where a different level of care may be needed to help that patient in obtaining the best fit for what's needed. Next slide, please. So with the Compassionate Care Act in Article 33, the definition of a practitioner is one who is qualified to treat patients with one or more of the serious conditions. But I like to point out here that the law states that the practitioner must be licensed in good standing as a physician and practicing medicine per Article 131 of the Education Law. Nurse practitioners are also included, as well as physician assistants who are added in regulation. But what you'll see later on with the new legislation is that these types of prescribers who are eligible to register with the program, or who are eligible to certify patients for the medical use of marijuana, has expanded. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this previously. The registered organizations are the entities responsible for the growing, the manufacture, the distribution, dispensing of medical cannabis products in New York State. They must manufacture indoors, or they can use in greenhouses as well. There are several requirements in regulation around labeling and packaging, testing to make sure that the cannabinoid profile is tested, so a patient will know how much THC or CBD content is in that product. Again, going back to that one of the first slides I presented, where THC is and CBD have different effects, and different combinations may help patients with different medical conditions. So it's important to have that information available for medical patients. Also information regarding pesticides and testing around that. Next slide, please. So what's changing with the medical cannabis program with the new legislation? The Compassionate Care Act, which was signed in July of 2014, is repealed and being replaced, and Axel will talk more about that. We have new medical conditions. So in addition to the conditions I presented earlier, the ones listed here are new conditions that are added, as well as any condition recommended by a patient's practitioner. So it really broadens the scope to help those patients who may be suffering from a condition where they're looking for an alternative, and also helping those prescribers and weighing the risks versus the benefits for their patients. The definition of practitioner, as I mentioned, is changing, so that reference to education law that limits to physicians now opens it up. So for example, a podiatrist who was not previously eligible to participate in the program with this new definition could participate. Increases the number of caregivers. This is a pretty interesting piece. One might wonder, why would we need to have more than 2 caregivers? Can tell you as a mom, it takes a village to raise a family, and there are many times where grandparents are helping, and when you're talking about, seriously ill loved ones, having additional caregivers to be able to jump in and help out is really critical. So this one is really important to those who are suffering from a medical condition and need that extra help. New forms. So the prohibition on smoking is gone with the new legislation. The new legislation increases the number of registered organizations, as well as a focus on underserved and underrepresented communities, and also permits home cultivation for patients. One more piece here is the registered organizations we have today would be allowed to participate in the adult use market, of course, subject to the requirements that are mandated by the new office that Axel will talk more about next. So I believe that is all I have for you today. And Ty, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce our next speakers.
Thank you, Nicole. I will be introducing Axel and Chris at this moment. So first, Axel Burnaby, Assistant Counsel for Health to Governor Andrew M. Cuomo. In his role, Axel oversees the development and implementation of all medical, hemp, and adult use cannabis initiatives in the state. Over the past 4 years, he has directed and supervised the expansion of the medical cannabis program and the launch of the state's hemp program. Axel is also responsible for driving the administration's proposed Cannabis Act that would comprehensively regulate all segments of the cannabis economy, including the creation of a new Office of Cannabis Management that will permit the implementation of an adult use program. After Axel, Chris will be speaking. Chris Alexander, Government Relations and Policy Manager for Village, a multi-state cannabis company. Chris is a criminal justice reformer, advocate, and policy expert. He is a seasoned politico with significant policymaking experience. Chris has previously worked for the New York State Democratic Party as a legislative aide to Congress and as counsel to the New York State Senate, where he managed the work of several committees providing oversight over the affairs of New York City and over New York State's criminal justice system. So I'll now share my screen again and pass it over to Axel.
So as, oh, there you go. I was going to say thank you, Ty. So thanks for that introduction as well. So I'm going to kick it off a little bit, but Chris and I are going to kind of work this together. The idea was following on when Rick set out, which I think he did a very good job of explaining the history of how we kind of got to where we are in many respects. And Nicole did a really good job of explaining the medicinal background for this cannabis plant. We were going to start, we were going to describe a little bit what recently happened, which was the passage of adult use cannabis legislation in the state of New York, which is a fairly big deal, as you'll see with some of the slides, and we'll only be able to really touch on some of the slides or some of the issues, but it really does touch a lot of aspects of society, ranging from criminal law, obviously, to driving, medicine, health and wellness, family court. It's an exceptionally broad topic. But just to contextualize what we did, if you think about the prohibition of cannabis from when Rick was talking about it, prior to criminalization, and particularly in the 30s, you really had cannabis being used mainly medicinally and probably recreationally, as well. And then for the reasons that Rick started to explain, and I thought were driven home by some of the statements in some of the movies we saw, you really see a concerted political effort to criminalize a plant and a substance, and that's had tremendous implications on the U.S. and global population. And I think the big change that we've tried to instill in this new bill is to shift the framework that governs this plant away from criminal law and towards public health law. So Ty, if I can trouble you to go to the next slide. I'm also having, there we go. So what's this policy shift? Well, the way we've sought to control, for whatever reasons, if you want to believe they're political or just moral reasons, we've sought to control use and sale of cannabis in all its forms, including medicinal forms, through the criminal law. And that's resulted in very serious consequences, collateral consequences, generational trauma, and what. And Chris can talk a little bit more about that, because he's really done an incredible job bringing that to light and exposing some of those consequences. So the state's view is that looking at cannabis through the regulatory lens through which we should look at cannabis is the public health framework. And we should be looking at folks that consume cannabis and public health education, public safety. We should be looking at it in a legal tax and regulatory framework rather than a criminal framework. And so that's really the pillar of the bill. There are three legs to the stool, as we like to say, and all three of them roll up to an overarching view of making sure that folks consume reasonably safely, and that this compound that can be abused is used responsibly. So public safety is the first leg of the stool, social justice is the second leg of the stool, and economic development is the third. And another thing that Rick and Nicole did really well was explain the versatility of this plant and just the multiple uses that you have. 90 years of driving the plant underground has meant that the sort of scientific and pharmaceutical revolutions that have gone with all other compounds have really bypassed cannabis. And when I say cannabis, I mean hemp as well as medicinal or adult use or recreational cannabis. So what we're seeing is an explosion of interest and opportunity in not only recreational uses of cannabis, but also in medicine, in health and wellness, in bioplastics and compounds and fibers. As Rick was saying, this was being used like that before. And so now we're trying to reverse engineer 90 years of industrialization and scientific innovation onto this plant. So it's really much broader than just adult use. But what we've tried to do here is create an office that would house all things cannabis. And so in fact, we've created a new section of law that deals with the hemp that Rick spoke about at first, the medicinal program that Nicole just mentioned, and then the adult use law. So all of them are going to be under one law, and all of them are going to be under one new administrative agency called the Office of Cannabis Management, that's going to be overseen by a new board, a cannabis control board. So if we go to the next slide.
But just before we transition, Axel, I just wanted to add, in terms of the intersectional approach that Axel was mentioned, that was taken with developing, drafting this piece of law, the new cannabis law. I think the external push as well was creating or helping people recognize the intersectionality of our cannabis policy with the impact that it could have on public health in terms of patients' rights to access, as well as the criminal justice outcomes and impacts. And so, you know, as we go through, I just want to keep in people's minds the understanding that, you know, from our position as drafters, as policymakers, the focus was in really untangling the way that both the drug war, cannabis prohibition, and those associated policies have impacted communities, have prevented, you know, research and development on that side, has inhibited patient access and their ability, folks' ability to care for themselves. And so all of that kind of should be in the back of your mind. It was looking for ways to undo, you know, 80 years of layered policies that go throughout, as Axel mentioned, family law, criminal procedure, et cetera.
That's a great point, Chris. And
Axel, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but if you want to try playing with the Wi-Fi network or turning off your video to see if the connection resumes.
Froze on us.
Hi, this is Rick. How about switching over to Chris and let him carry on until Axel picks up?
That works. All right. So as you know, as mentioned, we created a new body of consolidated law. And, you know, for the non-lawyers or the non-law students in the room, you know, similar to the criminal procedure law or family law, we created a brand new cannabis law that, as Axel mentioned, would house this really comprehensive framework. There will be a 5-member control board who are responsible for licensing and really deciding what the framework is for this agency. This was modeled similar to SLA. They have a 3-person board that, you know, really mostly handles licensing, but knowing the broad lift that the new office would have, we felt it appropriate to similarly assign this work to a body rather than a single individual. As the breakdown is here is who appoints them, 3 of which appointed by the governor, 1 by each house in the legislature, and 1 of the governor appointees to serve as chair. You can go next slide. So there are a couple of other key positions that we layered throughout the bill. One is the executive director position, which was mentioned on the previous slide as kind of a COO in many ways to run the day-to-day operations of the office, handle enforcement, compliance, et cetera. But also there, you know, one of the keyest positions is the chief equity officer. Now this came about in conversations with the legislature, folks wanting to have an independent sort of, you know, person that was focused on making sure that the bill or the implementation met the goals and the intent of the bill and creating a new, diverse, accessible industry in the state of New York. We also created a cannabis advisory board, knowing that, you know, this is something that's new. It's going to need a lot of input. Now, this 13-person board is intended to provide guidance to the executive director and to the control board in the formation of regulations, and to assist in the administering of what we'll talk about later is kind of really a central theme of the bill, Community Reinvestment Fund, which will be going to, you know, communities most impacted, but also to particular causes that have been identified in the statute. Axel, you back on?
I am, and I apologize. I think I jinxed myself when we were doing our prep, where I said I haven't suffered any technical difficulties, and I promptly kicked the power cord and unplugged my computer. So I apologize.
You're good. I tried to keep it going for you. Don't worry.
It's excellent. No. I mean, you've nailed it. That's what the office, and I think that you highlighted the board and the control board and the advisory board are both reflections of the need to have participation from stakeholders, the community, the legislature. This was really a joint effort. I think the next slide goes to starts on the medical, right? If Ty, yeah. So before we go there a second, I wanted to go back a second to what Chris had said, because he said the intersectionality and what we're trying to undo. I think Chris deserves a lot of credit for what he just described. Chris was has worked at the Drug Policy Alliance, which is one of the advocacy groups that has really been pushing for the legalization of adult use for many years. And when I first joined the governor's office, we met for the first time about 5 years ago when Chris came in and introduced the concept of adult use legalization in the state of New York. And at that time, we had just passed the medical program. Nicole and I and Rick were working on just getting our head around how do you start introducing medical cannabis, which has been banned for 9 years. And here was someone who was talking about the radical injustice of what was happening every day in New York with respect to possession and arrests of folks for minor possession of cannabis, marijuana. It was just not on the political radar. It was difficult to understand and to talk about that at that time. And yet now, 5 years later, here we are with a bill and trying to implement a fairly significant social transformation on this. So really, Chris couldn't be more right. I've seen it in my time inside the governor's office, the evolution of the thinking, the realization of the social inequities related to criminalization. And this is really an effort to right those wrongs. So you'll be seeing the reinvestment in the communities are a huge part of it. The way the licensing structures have been set up and the way we're encouraging social equity participation is really all built around that premise. In a responsible sort of public health way. So it's been a very long journey, but a really extremely rewarding one. So Ty, if we can go to the next slide. So here's some evidence of what we were just saying. Chris, I can take this one, and you can maybe take the next slide if you want. But
sure.
When so we've been discussing this for several years. The legislature first put the bill out and had a two-tier market structure. And what does that mean? Well, it's similar to alcohol. We actually have a system where you can't own the retail distribution if you're also a supplier. So if you're Budweiser and you're manufacturing alcohol, you can't own the retail outlet. You can't have a Budweiser liquor store or beer store. And the reason for that, just as it was back in for alcohol, is the idea that you're going to decentralize production and retail. You're going to have small businesses participate in the economy. You're going to have less barriers of entry, less consolidation in the market. And that's the backbone of the way that the system's built. And that reflects, again, the social justice and economic priorities. The license type, it's what you see in most other states. You're gonna have growers and processors and distributors. You're gonna have cooperatives and micro businesses. Those are somewhat unique to the cannabis industry, and again, infused with social equity and social justice. What we're trying to do on the micro business side, for example, is have small growers that would be able to do, maybe they're already doing illicit grows, maybe they're familiar with the cannabis plant and want to try their hand at growing, but don't have the capital to really build out a full grow facility. They'd be able to do a small grow, process and distribute and sell their own products. So they would be a special carved out license that could be vertically integrated in that way, and that would facilitate their participation. The co-ops is the idea that you can have alternative economic models and that you can incentivize the use of cooperatives in the grow space or even in production. So that's another example of what we've done. The selection criteria, interestingly, I think there are two really big thrusts here. There's the social equity that we've been saying, and Chris can maybe talk a little bit about how we got to the definition of this, of these criteria, and how the legislature was thinking about it at the time when it was drafted too, because we adopted a lot of their language. but there's social equity in the criteria here, and then there's environmental sustainability. I think we have in this bill probably one of the country's most progressive and aggressive set of standards on sustainability. If you're going to grow, you really have to mind your carbon footprint, because growing cannabis indoors is extremely energy intensive. And so we're asking applicants to show the state how they're going to be sustainable, reduce their carbon footprint, be wise on water use. So those are two fairly progressive elements. And then, of course, quality control, public health, and consumer protections. That's really a big part of what this is about. If folks are consuming in the illicit market anyway, part of the tax and regulate is regulate, which means make sure you're testing everything that's coming out into the market, make sure that the packaging and labeling is clear so people know what they're consuming, make sure that you don't, allow excessive advertising, so you don't target youth and you don't target minors and children, stuff like that. So, I mean, that's really all built into this Article 4 and this section of the bill. If you want to go to the next page, Ty, and Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. And quite a little bit to say here. I know we're kind of running tight on time, but did want to just, on the previous slide and on this slide, the intent here is really to make sure that we're providing as much opportunity and access to the market as possible. Folks will continue to hear the term social equity as we go through implementation. And for those of you who have been following the industry, you've heard that term a lot over the last couple of years. Now, the definition of social equity to many is, getting Black people licenses. We think of it a little bit differently. We think of it about as access and opportunity, but also as, making sure that we're able to have people create sustainable businesses. So what we've done here in New York, and this is, again, modeled off of what has happened in other states, timeline is a little weird. So New York's bill, at least this version of the bill that contains some of these strong social equity provisions, was drafted at the same time as Prop 64 in California, as Question 4 in Massachusetts was being implemented, as the Illinois bill. These are all kind of drafted around the same time, and so there were some concepts that were here, but we needed to see how they played out in other states before taking a step further in that direction. Or pivoting and trying to approach it in a different way. So what we have in our terms of our social and economic equity program is really an MWBE program on steroids, essentially, where we're really trying to target the folks who we want to access the market. That includes people who've been impacted by prohibition. That includes people who live in communities that have been over-policed for marijuana possession offenses. That includes, social and economically disadvantaged farmers who are struggling to keep, products flowing and keep their industry alive. And so what we did here was first, create a definition for that term, as stated in the slide, add a goal of 50%, similar to an MWE program, where we have just a goal so that we're not infringing on any constitutional limitations on prioritizing these communities. But then we did a couple of other things, one of which is mentioned above, creating as many doorways and opportunity points or doorways for access as possible by making sure that the market stayed broken up. And then separate from that, on the back end, making sure that folks who are interested in coming into this industry have the type of support that they need. Now, I work for a cannabis company now, and compliance, meeting all, the regulations in a state, making sure that, legally with, dealing with the federal prohibition, not stepping on any landmines, is very challenging and very resource heavy. And so we've created a program, an incubator program, that will provide the necessary compliance support, legal assistance, but also help with small business coaching and financial planning, to make sure that we are creating businesses that are going to be sustainable, and that really are going to be able to change communities. That was always the goal. And I want to say one piece about why we're doing this, that I didn't mention yet. When we started the campaign, first was running in New York, the marijuana arrest campaign. Now that campaign the goal was just to get New York City and the surrounding cities across the state to bring their arrest numbers down for low level possession. Now we're talking specifically about NYPL 22110, right? It's the second lowest possession level, possession of a joint, basically. And what we saw over the years, and I'm talking about 20 years of data collection, was that consistently across the state and particularly in the cities, the not just overwhelming majority, the astounding majority of those who are being arrested were people of color, Black and Latino specifically. I'm talking 85, 86% is probably our average throughout those, this period. And with the implementation of policies like stop and frisk in the city, Operation Strike Force in Buffalo, we saw a really strong exacerbation of the already racist policies that started, this drug war. And the targeting was ridiculous. And to give one example, folks who are familiar with the city, the Upper West Side, very white neighborhood. I think when we did the report of looking specifically in that neighborhood, despite being, I think, less than 12% of the residents, Black and Latino people still representing 72% of those arrested. And so what we saw was consistently across the state, communities, cities, that there was specific enforcement around this plan and really targeting in specific communities. And so this is intended to be reparative, to make sure that folks who were participating in the industry have a space to come in, but also all the harm that's been done, the $600 million that was spent on enforcement a year by police departments across the state is now taken and reinvested in new ways and by giving people opportunities. So I just wanted to say that because I know we're running tight on time and I didn't want people to go through this without hearing the motivations as to what got us here.
No, that's super helpful, Chris. And I can go through some of these slides fairly quickly because they're really just highlighting all the other aspects this touches. But I think the next one, if it's on tax, it goes directly to what Chris was saying, because what we're doing here, so what we're doing is actually we're reinvesting the tax money, to Chris's exact point, in actually starting to reinvest in the communities that were disproportionately impacted. So what's incredible about this bill is that of the entire, this slide talks about the taxation mechanism, which itself is very interesting because it taxes THC as a compound, and that's for another entire and a new CLE presentation. But what's really incredible is that the estimated revenue being $350, $400 million of revenue when the program is established, that 40% of those revenues, after some of the expenses of the program are paid, are going to go into a special dedicated fund, which is going to be used entirely to reinvest in grants into the communities that Chris was discussing. The extremely high arrest communities that put people in jail, separated families, created hardships in terms of access to banking, student loans, and all the other consequences and collateral consequences that come with arrests and incarceration. That money is going to go to repair that. And again, this is one of those kind of innovative pieces of legislation that recognizes the historical injustices, and while taxing and regulating, also reinvests that revenue. So that's a great part of it. Again, the tax rate itself is interesting. We can talk about it some other time. But if you go to the next slide, this is where it says the breakdown: 40% to education, 40% to those community grants we were talking about, and 20% to drug treatment, the public health mandate we were discussing. And then the next couple of slides we'll run through quickly, and then I want Chris to talk about expungement, because that's another big piece of what this bill does, which is remedy all the arrests and folks that were carrying these convictions and these these chains around them. So, but just to go through the next slides quickly, you'll get a sense of the number of topics and the number of ways in which this bill touches our daily lives. So if we go to the next one, that's economic, that's the size, sorry. Go back a second. Yeah, thank you, Ty. This is just the sheer size of the market. What we're talking about up to 1,000 retail dispensary licenses. We're talking about 50,000 new jobs. You were talking about our research and development into what Nicole was saying. There's a huge medicinal aspect that's combined with this. The hemp part that Rick was talking about is an entirely separate market. And here we're just talking about adult use and medicinal being such a potential economic engine. So all the illicit market and the informal sector market being brought into light, creating actual good paying jobs. There are union provisions in here so that folks get good union jobs. Next slide, please. There are all the questions about municipalities, whether a local town, village, or city can participate, wants to participate. Can they avoid having a cannabis retail shop on their main street? There's all the law around, municipal law around this. There There are questions about individual autonomy and individual control. So a whole other conversation that could be had even on this. And this is all addressed by the 256-page bill that we recently negotiated. Next slide. That's local control. Again, we can move to the next one on that. We have traffic safety. This is a big one. You know, one of the poll questions we had, and I'd be curious to see some of those results, is do we have an adequate way of testing for intoxication or for you know, THC levels in the blood or in the system? What, you know, THC stays in your system for a while. Does it mean you're still intoxicated? How do we measure it? How do we get to somewhere like in alcohol where we have a way of deciphering whether you're impaired while you're driving? That's a whole, you know, part of what we're doing still, and we negotiated with the houses to find solutions to that, and it was very productive, and we're going there. And let's see, do you agree with the decision to decriminalize? Oh, that's the entire poll, so we'll get to that in a second. But let's just finish these slides quickly, and then we can look at those poll results. Then the next slide, Ty. This is home grow. I'd love for Chris, for you to talk about this, but I think we still, just in the interest of time, probably want to get to expungement. But this is a big issue. If you have a regulated system, is growing cannabis at home like brewing your own beer, you know, a marginal issue on the side? Well, you're growing, you know, 3, in our case, you're allowed up to 6 plants, 12 plants per household if you're over 21. You know, that can generate quite a bit of pot. You can grow a pound or 2 off each plant, each cycle. You can grow several cycles if you have grow lights. That's a fair amount of economic activity. That's a fairly valuable commodity. I don't know too many people that are successfully selling, you know, their home brew, but selling cannabis is more doable. So how do we navigate that? We have rules in the law that would slow down and delay the implementation of adult use, so that we have a regulated brick and mortar system up and running before we do that. But that's just another issue, the intersectionality of personal freedoms and government regulation, and, you know, avoiding recriminalization and punishment of people that may be growing a plant that live far away from a dispensary. Really, a lot of really interesting social and political issues here. If we go to the next one, Ty, and here we go. So Chris, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So, I mean, this was probably one of the centerpieces, and I just a quick historic note. When the legislature introduced the first version of the MRTA, that was in 2013. Senator Kruger and Senator People-Stokes introduced, they called DPA and they said, hey, you know, help us draft an adult use bill. And the legislation was pretty simple, you know, ABC law, control F, marijuana. Over time, as you know, there were separate campaigns running, separate issues being discussed, there was a strong desire to make sure that whatever we were doing would also undo the criminal consequences of prohibition. And so I want to kind of frame this here as, you know, a follow-up to the longest running conversation. Imagine New York City, 2014. We're in a place where stop and frisk is policy, is the law of the land. You know, hundreds of thousands of young Black and Latino people are being stopped by law enforcement on a daily basis. And because of a small loophole in the law, from when we first decriminalized small possession of marijuana, a loophole in the law allowing for the criminalization of public view possession, hundreds of thousands of people were saddled with criminal records based on entrapment. And I can't call it anything else, because due to stop and frisk, when people were asked to empty their pockets and they presented whatever small amount of cannabis, marijuana they had in their pocket, they were then arrested for the offense I mentioned earlier. Now, this was, you know, infuriating for a ton of people, but people still, since marijuana was still legal, we didn't know what to do with it. And so it really looped in and became a driving force behind the legalization campaign. And in 2019, when we failed to get legalization across the finish line in that first go around of negotiations, this part of this provision was pulled out. And there was we closed the loophole, and then 2, we expunged those arrests, really those stop and frisk related arrests. This legislation contains a much more comprehensive law now that expunged almost all possession offenses. And that, you know, basically everything except the highest level possession offense have been expunged, and the 2 lowest level sale offenses. The intent there, of course, knowing that now that that possession is legal, it is logical to go back and undo the harm that was created by the enforcement of these laws. I want to say two more things. One about expungement, that's automatic, as you see in the slide, but there are still some future penalties for high-level possession. Will be a criminal offense. Sale is a financial fine, and sale to a minor, high-level sale, still criminal offenses. So moving forward, similar to other regulatory structures, we're still going to allow some restriction, but overwhelmingly in terms of the harm that's been done, we hope that we've been able to repair at least a good portion of that, even though we can't give folks back their time.
And thank you. I mean, I think again, there's a lot here. We could keep going, but I know we wanted to leave a little bit of room, for questions as well. And I want to make sure we get Nicole and Rick back into this conversation, because Chris and I have been going for some time. I think, the only other issues that I think are interesting especially for this group, if there are folks that are in the HR side, is there's a whole body of law that has to be kind of developed around workplace safety and use, and drug tests, and how do you deal with employers that want to control for potential impairment at the office, and with folks that are consuming legally outside the office. So that's another issue that's worth having an entire CLE discussion on in and of itself. But that said, I think we have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to kick it to our fantastic moderator and see how we want to handle that.
So we have a few here. I don't know if we also want to display the poll questions now, so you can get an idea of where everyone's heads are at.
Yeah, let's look at what folks have to say about that. So it seems that the majority of folks were in favor of the decision to decriminalize, and so that is not a surprise. There's the majority of more than the majority of New Yorkers feel that way, and especially among young people, it trends towards even greater support for decriminalization. Expungement, interesting. Again, overwhelming majority in support. Interesting that there were a few more people, or one more person that thought that you shouldn't expunge a misdemeanor for something that is now legal. Do you agree with the decision that to legalize cannabis under 21? I think that's a similar question. I think same seems to be the same kind of spread of answers. Should you be allowed to grow your own cannabis if you're over 21? Again, fairly overwhelming support. A few more no's, which is not surprising due to the complexity of managing that. Do you believe that driving while under the influence of cannabis can be adequately detected? That's very consistent. That's absolutely dead on. 75% believe no. So what's great about this poll and this answer is that education is already there. Folks understand that they have to be mindful of their consumption patterns, and that hopefully they'll think carefully before driving if they're consuming. Smoking tobacco is allowed. This one's an interesting one. Smoking tobacco is not allowed in certain indoor places in New York State, but is allowed in certain outdoor areas. Should smoking be allowed at all? And this is a more even split. And it highlights some of the health concerns about smoking generally. Secondhand smoke, the smell. This is a big, we have social consumption lounges, which is an issue we haven't talked about in the bill, which would allow specific designated areas where you can consume. And there's a lot of really good policy reasons for doing that, but of course not a clear-cut issue about smoking in the park or other places where you may be able to smoke cigarettes. So that's more even split, which is not surprising. Same next question: should it be allowed to be smoked outdoors? A fairly narrower split there I think for the same reasons. This is just testing your knowledge and seeing if you were paying attention. Well, you hadn't heard this one, Nicole, but hopefully you learned something. Any resident of New York who's a patient of a physician qualifies. So that's that's false, you have to apply to participate in the program, and you have to be referred and recommended by your physician. And then cannabinoid hemp products known as CBD have been evaluated by the USDA, and the majority of folks think it's false, which is correct. Most have not been evaluated by the FDA, and the Department of Health is now kind of responsible for making sure that the proper labeling and trying to regulate these in the dietary supplement space. So that's a fairly interesting regulatory framework as well. So that was an interesting set of polls. Thanks for putting those up. So I'm not sure if folks have some questions for the last 10 minutes we have here.
We do. We have one that asks, will the registered organizations be required to apply for an adult use license, or will their existing license simply be expanded to include the permitted sale of adult use recreational cannabis?
I can take that if folks are all right with that real quick. The bill speaks very clearly to this, and what the question is aimed, just to help folks understand that aren't familiar with the intricacies of the program. There are current medical operators that Nicole was talking about that we allowed to participate in the process and applied to get a license. They sell medical, and so the question is, how will they be able to participate in the adult use program? And so the bill itself allows for those entities to participate in adult use, but they do have to get a new license, a separate license. And remember at the beginning, we talked about the control board, and the control board is going to be made up of legislative appointments and governor appointments. And that board is going to decide what the terms and conditions of that license are. So, where, how much they can sell, where they can sell, and what the price of that license will be. But yeah, I mean, as established operators that already service the medical patients, the idea is that they would be able to participate as well. So yeah, that's the answer to that question.
Next is, what is the expected time for full implementation of the New York recreational cannabis law, i.e. when will licensed applicants be able to apply for a license?
That might be me again on this. I guess I think there's probably quite a bit of interest in the adult use program, I suspect, but if there's anything there on the medical, on the hemp side, I'd love to hear those questions too.
Well, I would just add, I mean, Nicole, standing up the medical program, you all had an 18-month time frame. You hit the date, made it happen. What do you kind of anticipate would be the time frame? And do you think that the work that y'all did standing up medical makes it easier now to stand up adult use?
Well, I think that's great questions, Chris. And I think, going through that experience, you really know what some of the important time-sensitive components are, right? Like, this is not something that is available the next day. There's a growing time frame, a testing time frame. There is a process, the regulatory development process, public comment period, adoption of regulations, and any of the, even for medical, if any of the changes require, adjustments to the IT infrastructure that's in place, a lot of things have to run in parallel in order to meet, for an 18-month time frame, a lot had to run in parallel to be able to hit that date. So I would imagine with the adult use cannabis program, there will be some similarities, in developing the application process according to what the board and the new office come out with as, the requirements and a framework for that application process that is in alignment with the regulatory development. So there are a lot of pieces that also collide, right? Because you have to take the development of regulations into consideration and ensure that, an application process considers that as well. So I think, long story short, a lot moves in parallel in order to hit an aggressive time frame. So I think the 18-month time frame was aggressive, but we did it for medical. I think anything shorter would have been a big challenge because of the fact that there was no plant product and they were the first in New York State, right? So now we do have these registered organizations that are already growing in New York State. Does that mean there could be some, different pathways that, would be considered I don't know, but I think the 18 months definitely for medical were needed, could be a little bit shorter for adult use.
That's a fantastic answer, Nicole. I mean, you really lived it more than anybody did, and I think that timeline's sort of what everybody's shooting for. It's a big program as well. So yeah, I think that's very reasonable. Super insight. Ty?
Axel, I think when you not skipped over, but went through quickly the slides on the localities, there's a question that asks, what does legalization in New York mean for job-related drug tests, and what can employers do if you test positive?
So Chris, you want to take it, or you want just on how we framed the 401D and how we...
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, if you think, I mean, mostly what we've done is mirror it to alcohol inebriation, right? Well, we still allow employers to protect, drug-free workplace laws, and to make sure that they, they don't have inebriation or impairment on the job. Now, there are a separate body of regulations for certain employers and jobs where federal regulation requires drug testing. That's protected, that can stay in place. But what we have done is for drug testing pre-employment, is that unless those separate policies exist, we try to focus and make sure that people aren't going to be unnecessarily discriminated against because of cannabis use, or their participation in anything that's made legal by the new cannabis law. Just to keep it high level, short. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, Axel.
Well, and the city has its own, right? The city has its own laws where they've prohibited the drug testing of employees for cannabis. Period. I mean, they've gone that extra way, and I haven't heard of any major fallout there. So, but there is a framework, like Chris said, for alcohol consumption, and that's developed in the labor law between employers and employees over time with precedents and standards and approaches, and it's 201D of the labor law. And that's really what's going to be used as the framework to start to assess whether someone's impaired. Impairment's not going to be allowed in the workplace, but you also won't be able to discriminate against someone because it looks like they may be, or their Facebook account shows that they may have been at a party where someone was consuming. So
I wanted to add something here real quick. I know we're running time. I'm gonna keep saying that, but there's so much to talk about. This is one of those areas where in negotiation, the original or the older versions of the bill, created a much kind of stricter prohibition that wasn't necessarily tied to other existing laws. And this is why, some of these negotiations and the staff that work on these bills, and shout out to, I see Nick Rangels in the chat here, who from the Senate side led the negotiations this year. Folks who are steeped in other areas of law, have familiar provisions that they're able to pull up and bring back into the negotiation on this file. That was, just a really good representation of that, where previously it was just a complete ban, similar to New York City, no drug testing for anything, and then we kept a little protection for federal laws. But now we've kind of really taken something that has precedent, that is people are used to, and that was a big component of how we move this thing forward with agreement on all parts, because it's an already existing law. Yeah.
And I think, a final thought on this too, just that process that Chris was describing, this iterative process between the executive and the legislature carried this bill for a long time, but for any student of government, I think this was one of the most collective sort of endeavors between legislature and the executive over years of modifying our bills and coming closer and closer together. And that's a lot of what Chris and I did, sharing information, working together for best practices. And we would come up in our budget, we present a bill, and they would improve upon that bill. And then the next year, when we got another opportunity in 2020, we improved on that again. And so, for the folks to think this may have been a rush bill, it just wasn't. It was a real iterative process, and labor and employment was a great example of how, to Chris's point, we didn't settle on just a stark new law, but we tried to insert and incorporate existing frameworks that we found. We found that only on a subsequent iteration. So kudos to the legislature and for Albany politics for working, well with stakeholder engagement. We had, ranging everyone from the local health departments to the state police to substance use disorder folks to advocates. Everybody was contributing to this process. Ty, we might have one more. One for Rick. There's got to be something for Rick.
There is not. Okay, so again, you might have touched on this, both Chris and Axel, but just general thoughts and opinions on the climate change impacts of the new adult use market. And again, anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I sort of touched on it. We actually have to, the control board is going to have to decide how to interpret those provisions, but the provisions themselves on sustainability, regenerative agriculture, reduced carbon footprints are to my knowledge, fairly innovative and fairly aggressive. In fact, if you look at the intent of the bill, it contains not only a lot of language about social equity and remedying wrongs of the past, but it actually also talks about safeguarding our future when it comes to the environment. And it sounds lofty in the context of just a plant like cannabis, but as we were trying to drive home, and I think again, maybe Rick did talk about this, so maybe Rick should have talked about hemp and how sustainable a crop hemp is. It really does have tremendous applications. You can have a significant environmental impact if you start to substitute hemp for other crops. You start to make biocomposites and replace bioplastics by hemp. It takes less water and less pesticides than cotton by a mile. You have food, hemp seed. So the plant itself has huge environmental benefits. But the way we're thinking about adult use is also that when you grow it, you're going to grow it in a way which is sustainable. But I don't know if any other panelists want to add to the environmental side to it, but I think it's a great piece of this bill. Rick?
What do I know? But I can add that imagine fields and fields of hemp instead of perhaps fields and fields of commercial hogs or cattle that contribute to greenhouse gases. I know livestock contributes tremendously to greenhouse gases. And imagine in urban environments, buildings and buildings filled with hemp instead of buildings falling down and being dilapidated. That's got to be very beneficial for the environment.
Well, yeah. Oh, Chris?
Yeah, I wanted to, when we moved on, just to hit like 3 questions real quick. I know we're tight on time, so Ty, if that works.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so I see expungement for DWAI offense because of marijuana use. There is no expungement for DWAI offenses. Those were illegal before, they're going to be illegal after. So just wanted to clear that one out. The other question I saw, program to assist individuals with applying for a license. Yes, we're going to be running around the state, doing a roadshow, creating an incubator program. There's a huge focus on outreach and community engagement to get this started, at least particularly on the social equity side. But there still will be other information out to individuals interested. And there's a requirement on the office providing certain information to the public about licensing processes. So yes, generally to that. And then how will legalization affects parents and ACS proceedings? This is really interesting. This was a huge fight. But I think one of the biggest victories in the bill, one of which is marijuana itself is no longer being able to be used to either to start an ACS investigation case file or in the furtherance of an investigation. What we found in the research on the campaign side was that although marijuana itself is not often used as the start, it is almost always used in furtherance. That is a parent where there's an allegation of abuse, gets drug tested, and then that positive tox then becomes the continuation of a file. So we've prohibited that part of it, but then what we also done on the backside in legislation is that any case where the sole, in looking back, in any case where there was a separation of a child from a family, and the sole allegation was the marijuana. There was no other finding of actual harm or any other finding of misconduct by the parent, those cases can be sealed. And that was a big thing because those cases stay open for forever, 18, 21 years until the child is of age. So I just wanted to flag those things. I think that was
fantastic. Rapid fire round.
boom.
So Ty, are you or Will gonna wrap it up or let folks off the hook?
Well, thanks very much, everybody. That was an extremely engaging and interesting discussion. I think from the questions that were posed and from looking at the audience, you've let a lot of people away very much informed on a very topical issue today. So thank you very much. And to all of you who attended, thanks for coming to see us. We have recorded this and we will send out the recording as well. Just a reminder on that code word for those of you for the CLE, that code word is hemp. So please come back a little bit later this month. We've got a panel on talent management on the 28th of April. And on the 14th of May, we have Zachary Jones, who is the VP of Labour Relations for United Airlines, and he's going to be talking about Labour relations. But and that to a fantastic panel. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. And for those of you who joined us, thank you too.
Thanks so much, Will. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here. Take care, guys.